Hey folks, in today's video I want to share with you some of the key things that I've learned about GitHub and why it's not only a developer tool. So years ago I used to think GitHub was a developer only tool. It wasn't something that I had a login for, it wasn't something that I was learning. I genuinely thought it was a developer only tool. However, as the years have gone by, as I have grown in my skill set, as I've expanded my skill set using the cloud, I've realised that I was massively wrong around that assumption, and I want to share why I think it's a tool that everyone in the IT industry needs to learn. So just to make sure we're all on the same level set, I want to explain what GitHub is. So GitHub is a source control tool where you can store your code, you can interact with it either using the website or you can use Git, and there are a few other ways that you can do it as well. But ultimately, GitHub has grown since it first emerged into the IT spectrum or the the industry. You can now collaborate with your colleagues, your peers, regardless of where you are in the world and regardless of how you want to talk to each other. So previously you could only talk in code, you could share the code, you could collaborate that way. But we now have features where you can discuss it, you can have an open forum, you can have issues, you can log bugs, you can do project management, all within GitHub. And it's also a DevOps tool. It's expanded its tool set into the DevOps arena. And when we think about that, it means that it has CI/CD or continuous integration or continuous development capabilities. So what I want to take you through is some of the key things that I use almost on a daily basis and why I think GitHub is a great tool. And hopefully I'm going to share some things that you've never known or give you the confidence to actually go and use some of these features and functionality inside GitHub. So the first one I want to talk about is GitHub Actions, and that's that CI/CD tooling that I talked about. So GitHub Actions is a continuous integration and continuous delivery platform that allows you to automate your build, test, and deployment. You can trigger a GitHub action to run manually or on a schedule or due to another event triggering it. GitHub Actions is a well-used DevOps automation tool, either on its own or combined with build servers such as GitHub, Jenkins, Circle CI, or even something like Azure DevOps. However, I am not a software developer, so there are other uses for GitHub Actions for me. You can use GitHub Actions to automate the deployment of your infrastructure as code, so things like Azure Bicep or Terraform can help you be stored inside GitHub using GitHub Actions and then automate the deployment of those resources going into Azure. But one of the cool things that I like for GitHub Actions is that it can automate tasks. So I have a workflow that responds to comments or pull requests on some of my repositories. This action responds with a message, either saying thank you or redirecting them to another place for more information. But it's also a great way of communicating. So when I'm on holiday, sometimes I change my messages there so that people know that if they've left a comment or a pull request, that there's not going to be any action on that until I come back on holiday. So I'm setting that expectation within the community. Let's have a little look at what that actually means in terms of action. So here I have a GitHub repository and I have a bunch of code in here. I have a .NET code source in here, and I also have some Azure Bicep code stored in this as well. Now, as you can see, it's structured very similar to what you would expect if you're using GitHub, but we have the git.github/workflows folder, and inside there is where my GitHub Actions is stored. So if we go inside this folder, we can see that there are two files. We have one called Bicep Build and one called .NET. And as you can imagine, both have different functions here going to the name. So if we look at the Bicep one, first of all, we have roughly about 40 lines of code, just under, where it takes my Bicep code and actually deploys that, takes it and turns it into resources inside my Azure subscription. And you can see different things, and I'm not going to dissect into the GitHub Actions file, but it has different sections, jobs, steps, that actually work through what I'm trying to do. It logs into Azure for me, and then it deploys that Azure Bicep template. So very similar to what you would do manually, but in an automated process. So if we go to the Actions tab inside GitHub, we have the run of these workflows, and we can go into a previous run that I've done, and you can see that it took over a minute, just a minute and 44 seconds, to take my template, log into Azure, and then run that template and deploy those resources for me. So it's quite quickly doing that. May take me longer if I was to do that manually. It's also showing me here, if I look at some of the logs, that there's some errors with my bicep code. I've got a parameter that is declared but never actually used. So that's something that I need to have a look at. But it's not stopped it running. It's continued to do that run for me. Now, if we have a look at my other workflow, which is .NET, it's very similar in terms of the length. We've got another 40-line code. And ultimately, this is building my .NET application for deployment. So if you're familiar with .NET, and believe it or not, I wasn't until about 18 months ago, it's following through those steps that you would do manually on your desktop if you were testing the application. So you've got commands like .NET Restore, .NET Build, .NET Publish, and then the last but not least, it's publishing that application to my Azure resources. So I deployed my Azure resources with my my bicep pipeline, and then I'm then using another pipeline to deploy the application on top of that resource. And again, looking at the run, it's taken about a minute, just over a minute to run and deploy that for me inside my Azure resources. So it's quite easy to get started, and it's quite simple to navigate and use. And it's a very effective tool, whether you're building infrastructure as code, whether you're building like .NET applications, or like I said, if you're using tasks and you want to automate things. The other feature inside GitHub, and it's probably one of the first ones, if not the first one, that I actually used, and it's GitHub Pages. So you can host a website directly from your GitHub repository. You store your code inside there, whether that's HTML, Jekyll, Markdown, Hugo. It will then get built and deployed to a website. Now it will give you a URL that you can use, or you can bring along your own custom URL. You can have custom things like 404 pages. So again, you have that full functionality of a website for you. And depending on the language that you're using, they will be built and deployed through GitHub Actions. So that code that you have inside your repository will actually get created into a GitHub Actions that posts it out and builds it to that URL that you've got. So you've got this free mechanism for a website, and I actually used it for one of my websites, a placeholder to a domain that I bought years ago, but it's a free resource for me. I just pay for the domain, and my hosting and my kind of code repository is all there on GitHub. One feature I enjoy is being able to web edit on the move. So I am sometimes not at my computer, or I have rebuilt my PC or laptop and I don't have everything installed on it yet. So I can access a lightweight editor to actually edit my code. So if I click on the full stop key on my keyboard, or swap the URL from github.com to github.dev, I get a lightweight editor, and it has a bunch of features and software installed. And it's also fantastic if you're working on large repositories and you don't necessarily want to download that all to your local machine, have multiple copies, or have that kind of workflow there. You can keep it all online. So have a look at this. I have this GitHub repository here, and I want to interact with it using the web editor. So I head over to my keyboard, press the full stop key, and my page starts to change. And you can see here, it's starting to open up a lightweight Visual Studio Code editor. So I am a big fan of Visual Studio Code. So being able to use this is really easy, and I am familiar with the interface here. And as you can see, I can start to interact with my files, start to do pull requests, start to do changes, start to do commits through this, just like I would do on my PC. I have the same kind of toolbars down the left-hand side. I have certain extensions installed. But it's a great tool if you're on the move, or like I say, you're using a different PC than normal. Something that I've been using more and more is the command line editor that GitHub have, and you can interact with GitHub via this command line, and it's pretty well resourced. It's pretty full functioned in terms of what you can do. So you can carry out tasks relating to pull request, issues, and other GitHub tasks to your terminal. So if you're working with code and you're in your terminal and you need to carry out a task with GitHub, you don't have to leave that terminal session. You don't have to go into GitHub. You don't have to launch another product. You can use it from within your terminal session, as long as you have, obviously, the GitHub CLI tool installed. So you can, like I say, you can work with issues, pull requests, checks, releases, workflows. You can call the GitHub API to script almost any action and set a custom alias for any command. You can use it whether you're using GitHub Enterprise Server or github.com. And the GitHub CLI is open source and ready for your contributions. So if you're a developer and you want to contribute into it, you can do and make it a better tool. So if you have a look at it in action here, I've got it installed on my machine, and I can issue some commands to start to interrogate GitHub and interact with it without leaving my console. Every command starts with GH, and then we can follow on from there. Here I am actually querying all the repositories inside of one of my GitHub organizations, and I get the names of that, so I can use that to maybe clone it or copy it or remember what I've called something. I'm trying to find an issue, but I've got no issues inside this repository that I'm working in, so there's no issues there. So let's create one, and you can do that from the command line. You can have that interactive experience to create and raise an issue. You can give it a title, you can add in some information into the body of the issue, so it'll open up Notepad for you and you can start to type away quite easily here and save that information. You can also add in things like metadata, tags, assign it to people, project milestones. There's a lot you can do from this command line. And you also have the option, once the issue is created, to go straight to the browser and have it and interact with it there as well. If I list my issues now, I can now see that issue that I've created. But I can also close the issue. So if I've worked on it, if I've completed it, I can close that issue and it's gone. I don't have to go into the browser. But as I said, you can actually do things with your workflows, so your GitHub Actions as well. So if I look at the GitHub Actions inside this workflow, or this repository, I have two that are active. I want to disable one of them because I don't want to use it anymore. I don't want it to run inside my environment. So I can issue a command here. Again, using that GH command, I can then stop and deactivate that workflow. So I do GH workflow disable, and then I select the one that I want to disable. And that's it disabled for me quite easily, quite quickly. And again, you could automate that. You could have that automated process happening if you wanted to disable or enable a workflow or a GitHub Actions, depending on certain events inside your environment. Something that's super easy and super built into this platform is being able to find files. So they have a file explorer built into GitHub. Now previously you'd have to use a browser plugin to be able to get this, but now it's built in. So if you're working on a large repository or you can't remember where a file was stored, you can press the T key on your keyboard and the search box appears. And it's quite good in terms of trying to mismatch or match what you've typed. So if you mistype something, it can still find that file for you. So let's have a look at it in action. So again, I have a large repository here and I don't know where my file has been stored. So if I click on the T key on my keyboard, a search box appears and I can type into that. So I type in checklist and it shows me all the files called checklist. And from here, I can select the file and it will open. It'll take me right to the place where I need to go. So it's quite quick and quite easy and quite convenient that it's built into GitHub as well. One feature that I've noticed pop up, and I'm not sure when it was released, is the ability to actually raise an issue or start a discussion around a single line of code. So when you're in the browser and you view the code, you can click on a line of code and start that discussion. Or you can even create a permalink to send to someone outside of the GitHub and to start the conversation. So maybe you have a query about why a colleague has created a line of code, or you want to explain something. It's a great functionality that it is built into GitHub, and it's one that I think is often hidden inside the browser. So let's have a look at where it is. So here I have a Terraform file inside GitHub, and if I click on the line of code, I get this little ellipsis that allows me to copy the line, copy a permalink, view Git blame, or reference a new issue. So I can reference that line of code inside something else. So I can, like I said, I can create a link, a permalink to that to send to someone, or I can create a new issue with it. You just have to click right beside the code in that blank space down the left-hand side, and that feature is enabled for you. Now, gists. They are probably one of my favourite features inside GitHub. They are so versatile. You can create a file with a code snippet, maybe a small section of code, and then share it with people without having to have a whole repository created for you and going through that process. It's great for maybe storing a small piece of code you can use for one time. So example is one of my gists. I have a list of Windows Package Manager commands that I use to install software on new PCs. It saves me having to look for the file within GitHub, or look for it on a USB drive, or to remember all those commands off the top of my head. It's also great for embedding code into blog posts that are making sense and are formatted correctly. So when I'm writing blog posts on medium.com, I actually use GitHub gists to embed code stored there. So I'll create the code in there, I'll take the link from gist and post that into my Medium blogs. So it's got that formatted code and you don't have to wonder where it is, and it's really easy for you to be able to copy and paste that to use it within your own machine. Now you can have public or private gists, but be aware, the private one's only private if someone doesn't have the URL. So if you give someone the URL, it's suddenly not necessarily private because they will be able to access it. It's only hidden because they don't know the URL, if that makes sense. So here's a screenshot of that winget command that I have. So we can see here I've got a PowerShell script kind of stored inside it. It's got all the commands here. And then I have the ability to copy it from this interaction, or I can embed it somewhere else. I can download it as a zip file. I can even leave a comment if I wanted to interact with it and tell the person that created this gist about it. Now, one of the last features that I am really interested in is GitHub Copilot. Now, GitHub Copilot is an artificial intelligence pair programmer. It can help suggest code to you. Write a comment describing what you want, and GitHub Copilot will suggest code to implement that solution. You can use it with your favourite browser as it integrates with Visual Studio, VS Code, JetBrains IDEs, NeoVim and others. It also works with a multitude of languages. I've used it with Terraform, and I've also used it with regex recently, because let's face it, who remembers how to write regex? This is a paid for service, so it's around £10 a month US dollars for an individual, or for a business license, it's around $19 per user per month. So it is something that isn't free inside GitHub. Everything else that I've mentioned is entirely free for you to use. But GitHub Copilot can be quite useful, especially if you're learning a language or you're writing, like I say, various different things, regex, and you're not necessarily remembering everything off the top of your head. What I want to show you is how I used GitHub Copilot to try and write my Terraform file for me. So I've started off my Terraform file here. I've got a few things already written inside it. But what I'm starting to do here is write a comment about what I want. So I typed in resource group and go GitHub Copilot, searched for that code and suggested it for me. I then hit tab and it was inside my file. That was all I had to do. I had to know what I needed. So I wrote here, virtual network, and it's provided me the code. It's provided me some of the code. I have to put in the IP address that I want in terms of my address space here for the virtual network. But it's starting to build up that code for me. It's starting to suggest all the things that I need within this Terraform file to be able to complete it correctly. Now you'll see there is a bit of a lag every time that I actually type in something. So here I'm typing in subnet, and you can see there's a bit of a pause while GitHub Copilot thinks about what it actually needs. And again, I'm not massively familiar with this, but not pressing the right key on my keyboard meant that sometimes the suggestions disappeared and I had to redo it. So it can be quite fiddly, but it can also be a great way of trying to speed up writing code or help you if it's something you're new to and learning. Certainly helped me in understanding various different things that I've been writing, like I said, in Terraform and regex recently. The one thing that I do want you to take away from this video is that GitHub is for everyone. There's lots of features inside it. There's lots of features for developers. There's lots of features for IT pros. There's lots of features for DevOps engineers. There's lots of features for students and much more beyond. GitHub is a tool that everyone should be using. Everyone can get benefits from it. And hopefully the features that I've showed up today are things that you didn't know about, or have given you the confidence to be able to go and use them and interact with them successfully. Thank you so much for tuning in, folks. Please do hit that like button and consider subscribing to my channel, and I'll catch you in the next video.